Hello, and welcome to week 11 of English 121. This week, we're going to be talking about figures of speech and poetry. After watching this lecture, you'll also be reading the chapter 18 on figures of speech in our book. You'll also complete a conversation and write in your reflection journal. This week, I'll also be posting times for you to sign up for conferences for next week. For us to sit down and talk about your last paper and to move forward towards your next paper. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about figures of speech. Figures of speech are whenever the poet is writing and he or she departs from the very usual denotations of words. There's two main types that you see most often in poetry. There's metaphor, which is a statement that completely replaces one thing with something else, which is not, in the literal sense, its definition. And there's simile, which is a comparison of two things indicated by some connective word, usually like or as. And these two things that are compared must be dissimilar. I have a famous poem by Sylvia Plath that's also in our book called Metaphors. And in it, she is using a list of metaphors, what we call an extended metaphor, about being pregnant. So listen to these. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils, oh red fruit, ivory fine timbers, this loaf's big with its yeasty rising, money's new minted in this fat purse, I'm a means, a stage, a cow and calf, I've eaten a bag of green apples, boarded the train, there's no getting off. So what's interesting about this poem is how she layers image upon image about the uncomfortable state of being pregnant. My favorite metaphor is a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. I thought that was good. But the idea is that by stringing these together, she not only gives us, anyone who's been pregnant or been around a pregnant woman or seen a pregnant woman, gets the idea of what it really is like to be pregnant by reading this poem. Because the metaphors give us more information about the state of being pregnant than if she just said, I am feeling larger, kind of like an elephant or a house. It's not as powerful as if she says an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. It really gives us so much more information. There's some other great examples of the use of figurative language in these 2 poems by Shakespeare and this poem by Emily Dickinson. If you turn to page 771 in your book, there's a poem called Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which many of you might be familiar with. It's a very common poem. It's often anthologized, but it's a sonnet, and it's it's sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines. By chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou art. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So the whole construction of this poem is on the idea of comparing the beloved, the lover, to a summer's day, and how by doing so, right, the lover becomes immortalized, is always remembered in this poem. If you look at page 1126, you see a different kind of metaphor and simile from Shakespeare. In "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." Part of the sonnet tradition was the idea of breaking apart the beloved into pieces, and the person who really invented the sonnet was a man named Petrarch, and he wrote in Italy. He wrote songs for Lara, which were a group of poems, a whole book of poems of sonnets for this woman named Lara, who he actually never met. But in them he would hold up pieces of Lara on a pedestal. And so this kind of process of holding up pieces of women on a pedestal became part of the sonnet practice. So and there became words that you would use to describe how beautiful your lover is based on this. And William Shakespeare is making fun of this in his poem, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." And this is sonnet 130. "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare." So you see a completely different approach in this poem, right? You see him comparing, basically cutting down his lover, right? He's saying that her lips aren't really that red, her skin isn't that white, her hairs are all, like wires, right? Her breath's bad. But in the end, it's still a love poem, but it's making fun of the love poem process. The last poem I want you to look at is on page 774, and this is "My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun" by Emily Dickinson. This is another poem that's an extended metaphor. So the whole poem begins with this idea of life being compared to a loaded gun, and that comparison goes throughout the whole poem. She doesn't actually mean her life is a loaded gun. She's making a comparison. "My life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day the owner passed identified and carried me away. And now we roam the sylvan woods, and now we hunt the doe, and every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. And do I smile? Such cordial light upon the valley glow, it is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night our good day done, I guard my master's head, 'tis better than the eider duck's deep pillow to have shared. To foe of his I'm deadly foe, none stir the second time, on whom I lay a yellow eye or an emphatic thumb. Though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I, for I have but the power to kill, without the power to die." It's a very mysterious poem, and this is a poem that would really be good if you not only looked at how metaphor and simile is being used in this poem, but also you looked up the allusions that are in here. Vesuvian face, that's Mount Vesuvius, is something you can look up as a reference. All right. Sorry, there was a pause in the moving forward of the slides. So here's some more figures of speech that we're going to be talking about. Personification is when a writer compares, gives a thing, animal, or an abstract idea human qualities. An example of this is the wind on page 779. Apostrophe is when you address something that isn't normally spoken to. An example of this is found on page 780 in the poem Hands. And hyperbole is when you overstate something for emphasis. And we do this a lot in normal everyday speech, but in poetry it's done oftentimes as a way to, really emphasize something. So a famous hyperbole is in Catullus' poem. It's called Carmen 5, which just means, in Roman, it means poem 5, where he talks about, give me 1,000 kisses, then another 100, then another 1,000, then a second 100, and then yet another 1,000 more, then another 100. So he goes a little bit over the top about how many kisses he wants from his lover. And it's a way of speaking how there's no end to how many kisses he would want. So, when you write about figures of speech, and one thing I want to start emphasizing, guys, is to really remember that what you're going to be doing when you write your paper is using all the terminology we've been learning about poetry. So I expect you to use words like metaphor and simile and personification when you're writing your paper as a way to get the meaning out of the poems. So when you're writing about figures of speech in a poem, and we are going to be practicing this as part of our reflection journal, you want to write, you want to start by considering the general scope of its key metaphor. What's the main metaphor, right? So in Sylvia Plath's poem, we know that the main metaphor is about being pregnant. And before you begin to write, you want to clarify which aspects of the comparison are true and which are false. You want to think about, why, what are all the metaphors and key images in the poem, and notice if there are obvious connections, or if the metaphors and similes in the poem are connected in any way, so it's extended metaphor throughout the poem, or if they're separate, right? So in Sylvia Plath's poem, all of those metaphors are about being pregnant, right? So there's or in William Shakespeare's poem, all of those comparisons are about the lover, right? So that would be a way to find unity in the use of metaphor. So the way you go through it, the checklist I want you to think about as you're reading for metaphor and simile and figures of speech in the poems is to underline a poem's key comparisons and look for both similes and metaphors in the poems. Then think, how are the two things being compared alike? And in what ways are the two things being compared, and in what ways are they alike? Do the metaphors or similes in the poem have anything in common? And if so, what does this commonality suggest? Okay? So, we're going to start by having a conversation about what is similar. If you go to page 778, you'll see it contains you'll see it contains 8 examples. Actually 778 to 779. I'd like you to choose one of the 8 examples and to answer the following questions. So in each of these figures of speech, what two things is the poet comparing? Try to state exactly what you understand the two things have in common, the most striking similarity or similarities that the poet sees. I'd like you to try to choose examples that have not already been written about by your classmates, so that as a class we are going to end up writing about all 8 of the examples. And as always, I'd like you to post your original post by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday night, and then also respond to 3 of your peers' posts where you take the conversation further about what's similar in the examples. Then for your reflection journal, you're going to have a little bit more freedom. What I'd like you to do is to choose a poem from this chapter that we haven't already discussed, and I'd like you to write a response where you examine how the author is using figures of speech in his or her poem. You must refer to at least 4 different types of figures of speech that I've mentioned in this lecture in your response. So that means you need to talk about metaphor, simile, hyperbole, personification, apostrophe. These are the main ones that I'd like you to talk about. All right. Finally, I will be posting information about your final essay. Not your final essay. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to psych you out there. Your next essay, which is you're going to be writing about poetry, and I will be posting that by next week. It has the same due date. It's due in 2 weeks. You'll have 2 weeks from the time I post it to finish it. But in the meantime, I'd also like to sit down and talk with you about your last paper and how you're doing in the class. So I will be posting conferences up on our on Blackboard this week. Please sign up as soon as possible. The conferences are for next week, so you'll be able to meet with me on Wednesday or Thursday or Friday of next week, either in person on campus or over the phone. All right, guys, next week is we're going to be talking about poetry again. We're going to be talking about sound. Please let me know if you have any questions. You're all doing great, and I look forward to seeing you online.